History Between Sheets original. The 1980s were India's awkward decade, not a time of revolution or romance, but of transition. It began with Indira Gandhi's return to power and ended with Rajiv Gandhi's unrealized promise of modern India. In between lay a country caught between grief and gadgetry, myth and microchip, black and white ideals, and color television dreams. If the 1970s burned with anger, the 1980s sighed with fatigue. The slogans had faded, the heroes had grown tired, and the nation, like its cinema, seemed to be waiting, not for change, but for direction. And yet, this is precisely why the 1980s matter. It was a decade that looked lost, but secretly rebuilt the stage for everything that would follow. Liberalization, globalization, satellite TV, and the rebirth of Indian storytelling. So tonight, as you settle in, I want you to picture something simple. A flicker of static on a black television screen. A Doordarshan logo forming slowly. And in the background, the voice of Jagjit Singh, warm, weary, wise, humming to a nation that's learning how to dream again. Because this is not just the story of India's worst cinematic decade. It's the story of what happens after the curtain falls, when the applause dies, the projector stutters, and a country starts whispering to itself again. Stay till the end, because this decade has a twist. For all its bad scripts and disco lights, the 1980s gave us some of the most courageous films ever made in India. Movies that looked truth in the eye when everyone else looked away. Directors who didn't just make cinema, they made confessions. I'm so glad we're here together, wishing you peace, harmony, and historic inspiration. But before we dive in, take just a second to subscribe to the channel. Only if you truly like what we do, of course. No pressure. And before we set off on this cinematic journey through time, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments below. Let's build a global community of history lovers, one story at a time. By the time the 1980s arrived, the echoes of that broadcast still lingered. India had survived censorship, protest, and exhaustion. The nation stood blinking into a decade that promised color, but carried the weight of yesterday's black and white truths. The 1970s had ended with questions. The 1980s began without answers. Democracy had returned, but trust had not. Indira Gandhi, once ousted, was back in power, older, sharper, and less forgiving. The opposition was fragmented, the public cautious. Outside, the world was shifting fast. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were rewriting capitalism. The Soviet Union was beginning to crack, and technology was quietly tiptoeing toward the living room. In India, it started with a screen, not the one in theaters, but the one that sat on a wooden cabinet with two knobs and an antenna pointing to the sky. Doordarshan. It became the new hearth of the Indian home. At 7:30 every evening, families gathered around it as if attending a national ceremony. The news came first, solemn, scripted, and often late, followed by culture packaged in half-hour episodes. Chitrahar brought film songs into drawing rooms. Humlog introduced the middle-class family to itself. Bunyad revisited the trauma of partition and made it episodic, palatable, and almost therapeutic. And then came Ramayana and Mahabharata, mythological blockbusters that turned Sunday mornings into collective worship. Television was no longer a luxury, it was a mirror. For the first time, people in distant villages saw faces that looked like theirs, speaking Hindi in living color. The Prime Minister's speeches shared airtime with Sita's devotion and Krishna's counsel. It was both progress and propaganda, technology had improved, content had not. The 1980s would later be remembered as one of the weakest decades of Hindi cinema in terms of quality, and yet, paradoxically, one of the richest in courage and experimentation. The first wave of the decade glittered in neon. The disco ball replaced the moral compass. Mithun Chakraborty became the disco dancer, a symbol of aspiration wrapped in polyester. Anil Kapoor, with his mustache and manic energy, became the everyday hustler India loved to root for. Rishi Kapoor kept singing in Switzerland, proving that romance could survive inflation. Mainstream cinema, tired of introspection, surrendered to excess. Plots became predictable, villains cartoonish, heroines ornamental, and songs omnipresent. If the 1970s had been about class struggle, the 1980s were about costume changes. Even grief looked glamorous under colored lights. But beyond the dazzle, another cinema was breathing quietly, one that preferred the sound of truth over the beat of disco. This was parallel cinema, India's artistic rebellion in slow motion. It had begun in the 1970s with directors like Shyam Benegal and Mrinal Sen, but it found its depth in the 1980s. Budgets were small, emotions large, and honesty uncompromising. Actors like Amal Palekar, Farooq Sheikh, Deepti Naval, Smita Patil, Nasiruddin Shah, and Om Puri became household names for audiences who sought substance over spectacle. They were the faces of sincerity. No glitter, no guns, just gravity. In Chashme Budur and Katha, Farooq Sheikh and Deepti Naval portrayed love the way real people lived it. Shy, clumsy, tender, and timed to Jagjit Singh's ghazals. Saath Saath hummed of middle-class dreams on limited salaries, while Golmal's soft humor carried forward the realism of hope. These films weren't loud. They were lived in. They smelled of filter coffee, rain-soaked bus stops, and typewriter ink. They were stories where ambition was as small as a promotion and as large as dignity. Then came the filmmakers who turned frustration into philosophy. Govind Nihalani's Aakrosh, 1980, opened the decade with a gut punch, a searing look at caste, class, and the failure of law. It wasn't entertainment. It was an indictment. The film's silence screamed louder than most dialogues of the decade. 2 years later, Saeed Mirza asked a question through his film, Albert Pinto Ko Gusa Kyun Aata Hai. Why does Albert get angry? Because promises of equality sound hollow when the rent is due. The anger of the 1970s had become the disillusionment of the 1980s. Ardh Satya, 1983, followed, the story of a policeman who discovers that the real criminal lives within the system that pays him. Ampuri's performance was raw, exhausted, human. The film was a confession on behalf of every honest man who ever compromised just to survive. And then came Sparsh, 1984, directed by Saaransh. Made in 1979, but released years later, it broke one of Indian cinema's oldest habits, treating disability as tragedy. Instead, it gave us empathy without pity, independence without spectacle. The same year, Saaransh told the story of an old couple who had lost their son, but not their capacity for meaning. It was a film about grief and grace, about ordinary people holding on to life after it had stopped being kind. That year was remarkable for another reason. Mahesh Bhatt's party peeled off the masks of the elite, revealing how art and activism had become fashionable performances. Rebellion had gone soft, revolution had gone indoors, and somewhere in the middle of this seriousness came laughter. Dark, brilliant, unforgettable laughter. Kundan Shah's Jaane Bhi Do Yaaro, 1983. A film so absurd that sharp, it drew blood. While art cinema bared its soul, commercial cinema sold its body with flair. The two worlds no longer met. They merely coexisted. This was the decade when the demarcation between art and populism became impossible to ignore. One side spoke of truth, the other of tickets. And yet, even amid decline, a few mainstream gems gleamed. Kurbani, 1980, married action with rhythm, introducing urban slickness. Shakti, 1982, brought Dilip Kumar and Amitabh Bachchan together, two generations of morality in one moral showdown. Mandi, 1983, used humor to expose hypocrisy, while Ankush spoke softly of repentance and forgiveness. And Ek Ruka Hua Faisla, 1986, reminded audiences that justice, like cinema, is subjective and personal. By now, critics were calling the 1980s the lost decade of Hindi cinema. Audiences complained that songs had replaced stories, that violence had replaced emotion, that the industry had traded ideology for indulgence. But underneath the noise, filmmakers were experimenting with new grammar. They were building foundations that would later allow Indian cinema to reinvent itself in the 1990s. As the decade moved forward, India itself was transforming. The assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984 shook the collective psyche. The riots that followed in Delhi and Punjab scarred a generation. Trust became a rare commodity. Cinema, uncertain how to respond, sought refuge in nostalgia and escapism. If the news was unbearable, the movies had to be lighter. And so the disco lights stayed on. Bapi Lahiri's synthesizers filled dance floors and film tracks alike. The country that once wept to Lada now grooved to electronic beats. Sequins replaced symbolism, and the crowd was grateful for the distraction. Yet amid the frivolity, new voices were humming quietly. The ghazals of Jagjit Singh and Chitra Singh, whose music became the nation's private confessional. Their songs played in dimly lit rooms after the television had gone silent, reminding Indians that feeling was still possible, even when expression wasn't fashionable. In homes that owned a VCR, Hollywood began arriving on cassette. Pirated tapes of Rambo, Top Gun, and The Terminator introduced Indian audiences to a different kind of hero, one who spoke less, shot more, and always won. Cinemas responded with louder explosions and tighter jeans. It was globalization before globalization, smuggled through videotapes rented by the hour. At the same time, India's economy was creaking. Inflation rose, employment sagged. The middle class found comfort in consumption, in color, TVS, scooters, and music systems. Cinema reflected that. Characters no longer fought the system, they negotiated with it. Success became the new virtue. Mr. India, 1987, captured the decade's paradox perfectly. A hero who had to turn invisible to be effective. It was fantasy with moral fiber, proof that commercial cinema could still carry conscience. And 2 years later, Main Pyar Kiya, 1989, closed the decade on a soft note, an innocent love story in an increasingly cynical world. It was as if Bollywood, exhausted by its own chaos, wanted to return to simplicity before stepping into the storm of liberalization. By the late 1980s, India had changed its rhythm. The air felt heavier, but somehow lighter too, like the moment between exhaustion and awakening. The nation was on the edge of something new, though no one could quite name it yet. The Cold War was thawing, cable TV was whispering from the future, and a young Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, was talking about computers, modernization, and a new India wired to the world. For a generation that had grown up on transition actors stepping onto the world stage, the divide between art and commerce began to blur, ever so slightly. But before that reconciliation, there was chaos. The 1980s were still, by most accounts, the worst decade for mainstream Hindi cinema. Critics called it the age of compromise. Stories repeated themselves. Songs outnumbered scenes. Directors who once built moral universes were now building sets with disco lights. The box office didn't care about depth, only duration. As long as people clapped, anything could be cinema. And yet, irony being Bollywood's favorite plot twist, this so-called decline produced some of the finest films in Indian history. It was a decade of brilliance in the margins. Ardh Satya, Saaransh, Aakrosh, Sparsh, Mandi, Aakrosh, Albert Pinto ko gusa kyun aata hai, Ek ruka hua faisla, Jaane Bhi Do Yaaro. Each of them cut open society like a scalpel. They examined police corruption, moral fatigue, the hypocrisy of elites, the anguish of the working class, and the loneliness of conscience. Their language was not glamour, but guilt. Their sets were not castles, but cramped apartments. Their heroes didn't save the world, they simply survived it. Parallel cinema gave Indian filmmaking back its spine. It refused to lie politely. Every frame was a conversation, every silence an accusation. And even though these films rarely made money, they gave meaning to the idea of cinema as public service, not of propaganda, but of reflection. The 1980s also marked a new era for female narratives. The actresses of this decade were no longer content with ornamental roles. Smita Patil, Shabana Azmi, Deepti Naval, and Rekha brought intelligence and integrity to the screen. In Umrao Jaan, Rekha transformed tragedy into transcendence, not the victim of men, but the master of her art. Sridevi, on the other hand, conquered the commercial world with comic timing sharper than her eyeliner. She was funny, fierce, and unforgettable, especially in Mr. India and Chalbaz, where she practically rewrote what it meant to be a heroine. By the end of the decade, Madhuri Dixit had arrived, confident, modern, the face of an India ready to fall in love again. Journalist Shoma Chaudhary later wrote, "The 1980s didn't give women equality on screen, but it gave them volume." For once, the camera wasn't afraid to listen. Meanwhile, television, that uninvited guest from the 1970s, had now become the center of the household. If cinema was struggling for meaning, Doordarshan was handing it out weekly. Every evening, it offered stories that touched real nerves: migration, family, unemployment, hope. Ye Jo Hai Zindagi made comedy out of daily survival. Bunyad turned the trauma of partition into catharsis. And Malgudi Days, with its quiet simplicity, became the nation's favorite lullaby. Doordarshan did what cinema had stopped doing. It reflected life without exaggeration. And in doing so, it democratized storytelling. Middle-class homes no longer had to buy movie tickets to see themselves on screen. Now, their struggles, their humor, and their heartbreak were broadcast for free. By the mid-80s, this competition between television and cinema had reshaped the industry. Directors like Hrishikesh Mukherjee, who once balanced art and commerce effortlessly, were fading. A new breed of filmmakers emerged, unsure whether to imitate or innovate. Many chose imitation, of Hollywood, of their own past hits, or of each other. But a few, quietly, chose courage. Masoom, 1983, brought Shekhar Kapoor into the spotlight. A story of guilt and forgiveness, told with such restraint that it still feels modern. It reminded audiences that you didn't need a villain to tell a compelling story. Sometimes, human weakness this was enough. Then came Parinda, 1989, Vidhu Vinod Chopra's noir masterpiece that turned Mumbai's underworld into an emotional labyrinth. It was violent, yes, but also vulnerable. A film where every bullet seemed to echo a heartbeat, and in between those poles of softness and steel, Ankush stood quietly, reminding viewers that redemption is possible even in violence. The final song, Itni Shakti Hame Dena Data, became an anthem of decency in indecent times. These films were scattered, inconsistent, often overlooked, but they were proof that the fire hadn't gone out. It had just moved underground. The 1980s also redefined how India listened. Music, once poetic and pure, had become synthetic and shiny. Yet amidst the noise, Jagjit Singh gave voice to heartbreak that no disco ball could drown. His ghazals, Hodhan se chulo tum itna jo muskurarai ho, became the background music of a generation too polite to cry in public. His art lay not in perfection, but in permission. He permitted people to feel again. This duality, noise and nuance, defined the decade. Cinema was split between two Indias, one that wanted escape and one that wanted explanation, and both, in their own ways, were right. A factory worker had every reason to want 2 hours of song and color. A student of sociology had every reason to crave truth. The 1980s did not resolve that conflict. It simply televised it. The decade's final years shimmered with contradictions. Rajiv Gandhi, the young face of modern India, spoke of computers and telecommunication, while corruption scandals brewed quietly behind the podium. The Bofors case became the new national thriller. The Sikh riots still haunted Delhi's conscience. Punjab burned, Assam bled, and yet the markets grew louder, the streets more colorful. Cinema, as always, reflected this confusion. Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, 1988, revived romantic tragedy for a generation that had never seen it sincerely. Suddenly, heartbreak was fashionable again. The film's music, Papa Kate Hain, became an anthem for youth uncertain about both their future and their fathers. Then, in 1989, Main Pyar Kiya arrived like a cleansing rain. Simple, sweet, unpretentious, it returned innocence to a cynical decade. The audience, weary of violence and vulgarity, embraced it like a sigh of relief. It was a reminder that love stories didn't need formula, they just needed faith. Looking back, the 1980s were not a failure. They were a mirror cracked in interesting ways. This was the decade when Indian cinema forgot its rhythm, but found its voice. When honesty moved to the art house, and ambition danced in sequins. When television told the truth in 30-minute episodes, while theaters sold fantasy in 3-hour blocks. And through all of it, cinema endured. Because for all its chaos, it was still ours. Messy, emotional, inconsistent, and deeply alive. Film historian Lalit Mohan Joshi once called the 1980s cinema's adolescence, awkward, confused, experimental, but necessary. He was right. Without this messy middle, the elegance of the 1990s, with its globalization, multiplexes, and creative resurgence, could never have been born. The 1980s built the bridge from the idealism of Nehru's generation to the consumerism of liberalization, from the black and white certainties of old India to the pixelated pluralities of the new. It was a decade of adjustment, of growing pains, of contradictions that still hum in the nation's collective memory. So tonight, as you lie back and drift between thought and dream, imagine the India of that decade. The hum of a ceiling fan, outside. The city's lights blink uncertainly, like stars trying to remember their place. Somewhere, in a small editing room in Mumbai, a director rewinds film tape with his fingers. Tired, hopeful, stubbornly human. Somewhere else, a family argues over whether to buy a VCR or a refrigerator first. And in that argument, in that exhaustion, in that hope, lies the story of a nation still rehearsing for the future. The 1980s were not perfect, but they were honest about their imperfection. They were a decade that didn't pretend to be profound, but accidentally became so. A time when India's films, like its people, kept moving forward, sometimes gracefully, sometimes awkwardly, always earnestly. So close your eyes, hear the hiss of the reel, smell the old popcorn, let the projector flicker, because the show never really ended, it just changed frequency.